How a private equity investor manages his portfolio company is the area of private equity which is the most difficult to understand for those who are not in the industry. But at the same time, it is where most of the value is created. Private equity investors, the good ones, can together with management build up great companies across a multitude of sectors. What we want to understand is that how they do that. How do they do it? The answer will take us a little while to explain because it is not so simple. We can all understand what a full-time company manager does. He comes to the office Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and works to move the company forwards in his functional role as CEO, CFO, or sales manager, or some other role like that. We can understand what a mutual fund manager investing in quoted company does. He holds the shares, researches the company, follows the economic trends. He might attend an analyst briefing offered by the company, or other formal events such as an annual meeting. So what does the private equity style involvement entail? This famous active or hands-on involvement with the company? Well, it's a grey area. Where the private equity investor gets involved, we should say semi-operationally or a quarter operationally. This is a very nuanced investment which is easy to misunderstand. So before we get into details in a moment, let's take a step back and talk through a framework for private equity ownership, which will help us make sense of it. The framework has 6 major components, all of which contribute to the ultimate objective of increasing the value of the company over the medium term. It is important to note that the value of any company will depend not just upon its size or the size of its financials like sales or profit, but also its quality. First, private equity ownership is concentrated. The private equity investor will hold a relatively large block of shares, giving him more influence, such as, for example, the right to appoint a board member. Secondly, private equity ownership is close. The private equity investor will be looking to keep a close eye on the company, for example, by asking for regular reports or making frequent visits. Third, private equity ownership is rational. The private equity investor is a rational economic actor with a clear objective. He is not involved in dynasty-type family dramas. He is not worrying about elections. He is not interested in big company politics. Fourth, the objective of the private equity owner is to increase the value of the company over the medium-term period, which will result in lasting value creation. There will be neither boosting earnings for the next quarter, nor managing the company for families' long-term lifestyle. Fifth, the private equity investor wants management to have interests aligned with his objective of increasing value. So he wants the best people and he wants them to have rewards based upon company value, such as stock options, rather than discretionary bonuses. Sixth, the private equity fund manager is on the clock. His fund will be liquidated in a few years and he needs to get things done now. So no procrastination, but milestones that need to be achieved by hard deadlines. The best way to understand the intrinsic power of the private equity ownership framework that I just presented is to contrast it with other ownership models such as family ownership, widely held listed companies, and state ownership. Let's look at each ownership model based upon our framework. Private equity ownership obviously scores the maximum 6 out of 6, but we can see that the other models score much lower. This is an interesting conclusion we can make, that private equity ownership, irrespective of the talents of the people involved, is structurally and underlyingly superior when it comes to creating value in the medium term compared to other ownership models. This brings us to the practical side, which is the question, how does the private equity investor do it? One study analysed investments by looking at, firstly, how much time the private equity manager spent with the company during the first 100 days of the investment, and secondly, how regular the ongoing contact was between the company management and the investor. The study found that in the best performing investments, the private equity manager spent 50% of his time on the company during the first 100 days and maintained regular contact every week after that. So there appears to be a correlation between private equity manager time spent and performance of the company. This still does not exactly explain what the private equity investor really does. To answer this question, let's firstly divide the private equity investor involvement, which we could describe as intervention, into three categories. The first is corporate governance. The private equity investor makes sure the company has audited accounts, quality reporting systems, and that generally high levels of corporate governance are worked towards. The second category is networking. The private equity investor uses his business network to help the company by, for example, introducing new suppliers, customers, finance providers, new employees, and other assorted partners. The third category is management. The private equity investor oversees management, possibly makes changes, works at the board level, helps with strategy and acquisitions. So a private equity investor is a bit like an in-house banker, consultant, mentor, and more. To really get how this might work in practice, let's consider a fund who has developed 3 off-the-shelf action plans for its portfolio companies. It invests in a company and then decides whether it should deploy the light, medium, or heavy involvement plan, which will depend upon the circumstances of the company. As we can see, there is quite a range of things the private equity investor can do apart from basic attendance at a board meeting, strategy sessions, corporate retreats, joining meetings with outside partners, making introductions, basing himself part-time inside the company offices, seconding junior staff members out to the company for a while. That's a lot of very impactful things right there that can help the company. Doing all these things is quite labor intensive, and a private equity team is capacity constrained. They can only have so many people and so many hours in the day. So one thing private equity teams will do is develop a network of operating partners. Operating partners are experienced executives or experts who will get involved on a company-by-company basis, supplementing the work of the full-time private equity team. They may be experienced managers who will sit on the board as an independent, or IT experts who will help to create a new management information system for the company. It often makes sense for a private equity team not to have some competences as a core competence, but instead to subcontract these ad hoc. One typical area might be in the case of a buy and build strategy where a senior operating partner helps with acquisitions, both in the execution and equally importantly in the post-acquisition integration into the acquired company's operations. As we can see, the involvement of the private equity investor is quite articulated over different areas, ranging from strategy sessions to meeting customers. It can take place at a high level, like a board meeting, or at an operating level, like sending an analyst to help out on a project. At the same time, the private equity team does not want to alienate or demotivate management by interfering too much. So the private equity investment must be very nuanced, and careful judgment calls need to be made in order not to cross the line from support to interference. Do private equity fund managers always live up to this? Well, most do not. It's very, very difficult to pull off this balancing act, and most don't succeed. One study showed that only half of private equity managers actually have a post-investment plan for the company, and only 5% actually roll it out at all. So this fact might go some way towards explaining the wide difference in returns of private equity funds managed by different fund managers from the rest.